My name is Daniel Huffman, and thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you all for listening to me today and taking some time out of your day. I know it's evening, probably around dinner time for many of you over there in Europe. I'm coming to, it's the morning here, I'm coming to you from the central United States in Wisconsin. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts that I have about design, some things that I think are important to consider when we're doing design. The title of this talk is Design is Human, and I want to think of design from this very human perspective and approach this sort of three different ways that we can think of design as being human. And I guess the first place to start would be the question about what is design. And I know you all answered that question as part of your registration for this seminar. And I looked over some of your answers this morning, and there's a nice, great variety there to them, which is probably what we would expect, right? If we asked a wide group of people what they think design means, we'll get different answers. So it's nice to see some variety there, and a lot of you focused on, for example, design as planning something, right? Deciding on a course of action. Other people talked about design to them meaning to make something or to form something. And still others discuss design in terms of art and aesthetics. What does it mean to design? And to them it meant to make things look attractive, to look pleasing. And we could certainly spend a long time debating what the meaning of design is, but I want to lead off with sort of my own personal understanding of what design is and the way that I find useful to think about it. And it's very simple. Design I think of as simply making decisions in order to reach a goal. Right? There is something that you want to get done, something you want to accomplish. And I think of design as simply how do you go about accomplishing that thing? How do you move toward that idea that you have, that goal that you have? What decisions do you make? Those are design decisions. And it's a very broad and a very simple definition, but I think it's very empowering because by this definition, we are all designers. Right? All human beings do this every day. And so I have this image here. This was my breakfast this morning. And it's a very simple example of how we design every day. I woke up and I was hungry. And so that my goal was to no longer be hungry. And so I designed my breakfast. Right? I put some cereal in a bowl and some milk, and perhaps my mother would think that I should have some fruit or something like that, or maybe a little bit better designed breakfast. But I made some decisions about what to do with my time and my resources in order to solve this very simple problem of being hungry. And you know, it's a silly example, but it points out how hundreds and thousands of times a day, potentially, we're making decisions based on what we want the world to be. And in that way, we're all designers, right? Humans are naturally designers, and that's sort of the first way I want to approach this idea of design is human. Design is natural to human beings. It's something we do all the time. And this is empowering and encouraging, and I tend to focus on this a lot. I teach cartography occasionally. I lecture at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and this is something important that I try and sort of emphasize to my students. A lot of them are coming in without any background in doing any sort of graphics, let alone maps. And they look upon really beautiful maps they find online and they feel perhaps overwhelmed. Right? They think this is something that I cannot do, it's too complex, it's too difficult, and I want to encourage them to understand that designing is natural. Designing is something that they have the ability to do, and it's something that I want the general public to understand that we all do all the time, whether it's breakfast or whether it's a map. So you know, we can apply the same concept to something cartographic. So this is a map by a gentleman in Brazil named Eduardo Asta, and he put together this spread for a magazine, and it's about illegal drug trafficking. And so he had a goal, a vision, something that he wanted to accomplish, which was to communicate to an audience about what kinds of drugs are being produced, where they're being produced, and where they're being consumed, what parts of the world. And so he made a broad series of decisions. He chose to use arrows, for example, to connect the places of production to the places of consumption in order to communicate clearly. He chose to break out the different types of drugs in different colors in these sort of leaf-like sort of half-circle symbols to communicate the amount of drugs being consumed in different regions. Right? And if we break this down, it all seems very straightforward. but it's simply a series of decisions of colors and shapes and lines that he based upon his experience in order to communicate with people. So it's a pretty simple idea, right? Design is about decisions, and it's about having a goal and having intent and thinking through that. And while I'm on this, I want to address one thing that some people mentioned in their understandings of design when they answered the little entry question. Some people focused on design as being primarily something you do at the end of a map, right? You've sort of got all your data together and you've decided to sort of add little extra stylistic elements, like he's got these sort of nice little gradient colors on the arrows. But I'd like to expand that understanding of design. Design is not, to me personally, is not merely about making things attractive. Design is throughout the entire process of producing a map or any other object that we make. Making a map in the first place is a design decision, right? This map, for example, Eduardo Asta could have decided instead to make a table or a chart or write a report. Right? Choosing to represent something in a visual form, even before it was created, was a design decision, as well as what data he wanted to collect. Where will he get his information from? How will he process his information? All of these are design decisions, even before we've started to consider how things look. So I think of design as much broader than simply attractiveness or aesthetics or making things look nice. And in the end, we get this sort of nice, beautiful, well thought out graphic that he produced. And that's important to, that word thought is very important to my understanding of design. We must be thoughtful and we must be deliberate. Things that are not designed would be things that are thoughtless or things that are random. Right? Random is not designed because a random choice does not lead us toward our goals. Imagine if I had woken up this morning and been hungry and chosen to do something completely random, like, I don't know, stand on my head for half an hour. That wouldn't solve my problem of being hungry. Right? It's not a design decision because it has no connection to my goals. Or if on this map here, Eduardo Asta, if he had chosen his colors randomly or chosen the words on the map randomly. Imagine if he, instead of labeling these things with regions of the world and names of types of drugs, if he had instead put his favorite music, right, the titles of his favorite songs on there. It wouldn't communicate anymore because there's no connection between what he's trying to do and what he did. So to me, design is very thoughtful, it is very deliberate, and it's very intentional. And when we're lacking those things, design can start to fail. So here is a map I found online a couple of days ago about speed limits for automobiles in different parts of the world. And the colors here are very random, it seems. There's not really a lot of thought that's gone into the pattern of the colors that indicate each individual speed limit. And so it's not easy to perceive where broadly speed limits are higher or lower unless you spend a long time looking at the legend. And in fact, if you notice, the two lowest colors there for 70 and 80 kilometers per hour are black and dark red, which don't stand out very well against the background at all. So it's definitely very difficult to perceive, and it doesn't seem like there was a lot of thought that went into this. Right? This seems undesigned. It wasn't very deliberative. So the random and the thoughtless, I think, is where we fall down in design. If we're not doing that, that's not design. Another thing to me that commonly comes up that isn't really design are defaults. And so we have all this software that we use nowadays, and many of the programs that we use have default settings, something the software does without you telling. So if I go into Google Docs and I start to type something, it starts typing, my words begin appearing automatically in 11-point Arial font. That's the default in Google Docs. Or if I open Word, it appears, I think, in Calibri. And many of you have used ArcMap. I know you answered in the survey, or other GIS programs. You're also probably very familiar with something like this. If I go into ArcMap and I pull in several shapefiles, it will choose automatic colors to apply to those things and automatic label placement before I have made any personal decisions about how I want things to look. And defaults are also not designed because they're not choices. I did not choose these colors, right? I did not choose this sort of lovely orange color for lakes or this interesting sort of reddish crimson, I guess, for the rivers. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me as a map reader to see those kind of colors, and that's not something I would pick, but it's something the software did automatically. But there's no connection between the software's choice, if you can call it a choice even. It's not, the software is not thinking per se as we humans think, but there's not a lot of connection between the automatic decision in the software and the goals that I have. Somewhere down the line, years ago, when somebody created this, a programmer at Esri or a programmer at Microsoft or a programmer at Google decided what the default should be. But they're very far removed from me in time and in space, so they don't know what my goals are. So what the software is choosing isn't designed because there's no deliberation, there's no thought, there's no intention to it. And so we're left with something that looks very off, right? It's very, it seems very not human, right? It seems like it was designed by a machine, right? Did I make this thing if I didn't choose the colors, if I didn't choose the projection? It's possible that maybe the software deserves more credit for making this map than I do. And defaults, I don't want to be too hard on them. Defaults are very useful. I don't want to have to go into something like ArcMap or QGIS and have to first specify the exact color and line weight and projection of everything before I can see it. Or I don't want to have to go into Google Docs and choose my typeface and size before I'm allowed to see the words I'm typing. Right? It's nice to get a quick start to just very roughly see what I'm working with, and then I can make choices. But I need to make sure that I'm not surrendering my decision-making to the defaults in the software. The interesting thing that I find about this process is that it's possible now, in a way that it hasn't been previously, to make a map without looking at it. And you can imagine, since many of you have used GIS programs before, I can simply go in to something like ArcMap, and I could quickly add in some shapefiles and turn on the automated thing by just focusing my eyes on the buttons I need to click without actually looking at the map that I need to produce at all. I can ignore the map window and simply kick this thing out and save it and say that I'm done without ever having really had the experience of being the map reader without looking at it. And this is something new, I think, in the history of cartography, relatively new. Certainly we've had this software for a couple of decades, but prior to that, right, maps were all made by hand in one form or another, whether it was Renaissance painters and illustrators drawing things out, or people engraving on copper plates, or more modern techniques in the 50s and 60s with things like photoset printing. Maps were always drawn out by somebody punching painstakingly over a light table or the like with some sort of drawing implement. And what's interesting about this is it forced us, and I say us, I certainly didn't make maps in this era, I'm strictly a digital cartographer, but it forced cartographers to have the experience of being the map reader while they were being the map maker. You could not make something without seeing it and judging it and deciding whether or not it looked right. But now we can create things without looking at them. And in fact, it's sometimes necessary to create maps without looking at them. If you take the example of something like Google Maps or OpenStreetMap or other similar sorts of online base maps, this is a point that a colleague made at a conference, a presentation I went to last year. They pointed out that imagine zooming in all the way to Google Maps, and you can get this sort of very detailed large-scale street view. Now, how long would it take to pan across the map until you've seen the entire world at this scale? Now, that would take years, maybe decades, and then you have to zoom out to the next zoom level. There's 16 of them, I think, and then start over again. It would take more than a person's lifetime, probably, to actually look at the entire map that's been created here. So it's technically impossible. And this is a challenge in online base map design that a lot of people are starting to encounter now. How do you design and style something like this when you can't see the whole thing? And there's no easy answer for that. It's a challenge that we face as cartographers in this new era, but it does point out again this idea that we're making things now without looking at them, which is something new. And I think that we lose something in that. when we're no longer forced to be the map reader. Because we find that, if I produce a map like this that's full of defaults, it lacks something. It lacks a certain humanity to it. Right? These default decisions, they're made by the computer. Right? They're made by some programmer 20 years ago who made some choices about what they thought looked good. And if I produce a map like this without looking at it, I don't think I deserve credit for producing it. I certainly don't want credit because I don't think this one looks very good, so don't put my name on it. But I'm not forced to look at it as the map reader, so I don't have to engage with the fact that maybe I'm making poor decisions by turning things over to the defaults. And I'm left with a map that's very cold and alien and doesn't seem like it was made for humans, because computers don't design, and they don't understand human goals, and they don't empathize with humans or understand what humans find attractive or interesting or beautiful. And I think that's what sort of default-heavy cartography, or thoughtless cartography in general, a lack of design leads to. It leads to inhuman things. So let me give you another example here. I saw this recently. This is a map of all of the different streams that lead into the Mississippi River within the United States. Plus there's a little bit more up in Canada that gets cut off. The Mississippi River is a huge watershed in the United States, encompasses thousands of streams, but this doesn't look like it was designed for a human being. It doesn't look like it was designed by a human being, because it doesn't really look like it was designed. It seems a very sort of software-driven solution. Everything is plotted here. Every single possible little branch of water that could be indicated on the map is, and it's unintelligible to a person. I can't pick out any individual river or stream or anything like that, or any brooks. It needs to be generalized to be understandable. We need to definitely thin this network out. The color red doesn't make any sense to me as a human reader, even though it might sort of from a software default perspective. And it stands out certainly against the background, but it doesn't make sense to see red rivers. That sort of seems very foreboding, maybe, in like rivers of blood. I don't know. And these things all even sort of cover over some of the typography. You can see some of the labels that are hidden by these things. It's not a very human solution to things, and it seems like this wasn't made by a person for a person. There's no humanity in it. Here's a map of wind turbines and the noise that they might make. This is for a proposed wind farm in Wisconsin. And this is a very similar thing. This is cartography without a lot of thought. It's sort of quickly put together, because this was a government requirement that this map be made, so I imagine that there wasn't a lot of time and thought devoted into how the data would be portrayed. But it doesn't look like it was really intended for somebody like me to spend a lot of time looking at it. Right? And it's actually, if you spend a while with it, it becomes a little bit, you determine some of the ways it's actually kind of difficult to read. And this is on I have a breakdown of this map on my blog, Cartastry, which Christoph mentioned as one of the ways that he sort of came upon my work originally. So if you want to hear my thoughts in detail on this map, you can look there. But I think you see the point I'm trying to make, and this is sort of the second way we can think of design being human. Design needs to be done by humans for humans, because computers produce alienating results, I think. If we don't think through what we're doing, if we're not deliberate about it, and if we don't have intention, we produce products that look like this and don't succeed in our goals, because if we're not thinking, right, we're not meeting our goals. Right? This does not communicate very clearly to me, nor does the streams map. These don't communicate clearly, even though the goal was probably to do so. But if there's no thought toward that goal, then we fail in that regard. Instead, I'd like something like this. Right, here's a wonderful map by a gentleman named Owen Gatley, and this appeared in a tourism magazine, and it's about simply showing off a region in Brazil, the state of Bahia. And I don't speak Brazilian Portuguese, so I can't say if I'm pronouncing that right, but we'll go with Bahia. And it points out all these different, little towns along the coast, and what computer could make something like this? What computer would decide that these are the defaults? This has definitely got a lot of humanity and a lot of personality into it, and it feels warm and inviting in that way, because I feel like there's a connection between me and somebody else on the other end who made this thing, and that's what draws me into this. So that's sort of my second point. The first one, design is human because we all design as humans all the time. And the second one is design is human because we need to have humans on both ends of the design process. If we are going to have a human reader, we need to have a human designer. Because a human designer will understand and empathize with a human reader. And that's why we have this problem now when we're divorcing the map reading from the map making. We're not forced as the creators of the map to engage as a map reader and think about, how does our product affect the reader? What looks good, what seems off, what seems in need of changing. This now leads me to the third and sort of final point I want to make about design being human. If we think about what the cartographic function of this map is, what information is it intending to convey? So, it's telling me where this state is in Brazil. That's clearly marked, and I've got some little dots along the Cocoa Coast here, all the names of cities and towns. And it's got a map scale, 50 kilometers there. So that's all cartographically functional, right? I could use this to navigate around a little bit, figure out roughly where these sort of reference map functions, where these places are, and I've even got a road network, it looks like, in the background there. But what is the function of these tropical fish, or these trees, or this woman on a beach? What information do they convey? What data? And this is a perspective that a lot of people have on information graphics, probably most notably someone like Edward Tufte. Tufte is sort of a design guru who is very about efficiency. His idea is that we need to be very efficient with the ink we spend on any graphic, maps included, and that everything should convey useful data and communicate clearly and quickly with as little fuss and decoration as possible. But I think a perspective like that misses out on a lot of what draws people into graphics and maps. These fish have no information function, right? They don't tell us where anything is. But all of these extra little elements, these colors and this texturing and this printed look and this painted brushed look, all of these appeal to my emotions and to my senses as a map reader. They remind me of a warm and inviting and interesting place that maybe I would like to go on holiday, right? This is for a travel magazine, so this makes perfect sense in the context for which it's designed. But we can't think of this map strictly in terms of the data it conveys. We need to think about the fact that we have a human audience, and there are other things that human audiences appreciate besides simply the information that they gather about where cities are located. We need to appeal to their aesthetic senses and their emotions and establish a mood to things. Humans are not simply functional and data-driven. Humans are driven by a lot of things that are unnecessary. These fish are unnecessary. This woman is unnecessary on the map, and a lot of these aesthetic elements. But that to me, when we talk about design being human, humans are fundamentally focused on not just data, not just the functional, but a lot of things that are irrational, a lot of things that are emotional, a lot of things that are unnecessary. I think the fact that we do things that are unnecessary is what makes us unique. So I'll give you an example in NASA. Right? So, over 40 years ago, the United States government spent an unimaginable amount of money to build massive rockets, the most powerful machines ever created, the Saturn V rocket, in order to send a bunch of guys to the moon so that they could do this, so that they could put the U.S. flag down and salute it. Was that, that's a gross oversimplification, but I think, it makes a good point. What was the function of doing this? Did it solve a problem that humans had? Right? Was it necessary? It didn't end hunger. It didn't create peace. It didn't bring tranquility. It was something that humans did that wasn't based on what they needed to have done. It wasn't about feeding themselves or reaching prosperity. It was something they did to appeal to their sense of wonder and, in the United States, their sense of patriotism and their desire to explore. But humans, humans are fundamentally sort of irrational in many ways, I think, and very emotional. And to me, something like this, like the space program and landing on the moon, represents everything that is unique and beautiful about humanity, is that we are not driven solely by what must happen. And so I think that, that's very grandiose, right? How does this apply to maps? We can think about that in terms of maps. We don't need to make maps that are strictly boiled down to their barest functions. And it's very tempting to do that. Right? If I'm running a mapping company, or even a company that's simply ordering maps from somebody else for my business, I might say, well, it seems awfully expensive to pay extra money to do this beautiful terrain shading here, for example, or this vegetation. Why can't I simply indicate where the roads are and be done with it? Right? What is the point of that? But beauty is a function in maps. So to give you a little contrast here of how that plays out, this is a map of the Kenai Fjords, a national park in the United States. This is a natural protected area. It's very cold, it's glaciated, it's very mountainous and rugged, and this is by probably my favorite cartographer, Tom Patterson at the U.S. National Park Service. This is a park map, so visitors will come to the park, and it conveys all kinds of functional information. If you look very closely, there are little camping symbols. It indicates where the trails are and where some of the roads are, and things you would need to know in order to get around, and the names of peaks and other features. But it has much more beyond what is strictly necessary to navigate the park. And I think, to me, that makes this map work better because it is beautiful, because it is attractive. People want to look at it more, and people want to learn more from it. Let me contrast that with another park map. This is the Vermilion Cliffs National Monument. It's very similar. It's another national protected area, natural area in the United States. This one's a different landscape. It's a desert, canyons and the like. But this is made by a different unit of government. And it contains the same basic kinds of information as the previous map. Where the boundaries of the land are, where the boundaries of the protected area go, where the roads can be found, what the names of the features are, where you can camp, where scenic lookouts are. So it has, from sort of a data perspective, these are identical. Right? They contain the same kinds of information. But which of these two maps would you rather have on the wall in your office or at home? Right? A map that is more attractive, a map that appeals to more than just data, which treats our map readers as more than just conduits for information, or information storage facilities. Right? A map that treats people as humans with aesthetic senses will work better because people will want to read it. If I spend all my time making a map that's unattractive and nobody wants to look at it, then I've wasted my time. We make maps because we want to communicate something, right? We have a design goal, and in order to reach that design goal, part of the map's function is it needs to be read by people. And a map like this one for Kenai Fjords is more likely to be read. It's more likely to be looked at in painstaking detail by people who appreciate the beauty, and it's more likely to be shared. Right? So our audience will expand. So if I am planning on making a map to share information, or planning on ordering a map, maybe from a mapping company, let's say I'm a business person, right? It makes sense to spend extra time and extra money on these things, to look beyond simply what is functional and what is strictly necessary to communicate the data, because the form of things is part of their function, and beauty is part of the function, because humans are not machines. Right? Humans are not simply information storage devices, so we need to appreciate that. We need to appeal to those senses. So that's sort of my third point about design being human, that we must understand that we are designing for human beings, and human beings are not driven solely by the data that we want to convey, that we need to keep the aesthetic appreciation of our audience in mind. So that's sort of three perspectives on human design. We are all designers, and we need to have humans at both ends of the process. And as creators of things, we need to understand human senses. And so that's some things I want people to bear in mind. And I just want to finish up with maybe some examples of some nice maps. Christoph mentioned the Atlas of Design. And it's a project that I worked on through my professional society, the North American Cartographic Information Society. That's sort of the main collection of cartographers, main organization for cartographers in the United States and Canada. And the Atlas of, you can visit atlasofdesign.org to find out more, but it was we ran sort of a worldwide competition to look for beautiful and interesting maps. And I just wanted to share with you a few examples and think of them in terms of this human design. This is one by Alex Hodgson. She lives in Australia, and she was mapping out her family's farm there that her family had obtained recently, sort of all the interesting features where you can find trees and the different subplots and where the river goes through. And this feels very human to me. I'd have this connection with somebody at the other end of this document. And I think hand-drawn maps especially emphasize that. It's the same way that, you know, a handwritten letter connects to people more than a typed document or an electronically sent document. That there's a lot of personality that goes in handwriting and hand line work. So this really works for me as something that I appreciate spending time looking at, because I feel like it's made for me. This is not created by a machine. What algorithm, what default would produce something like this, would think to produce something like this? This appeals to me and my aesthetic senses as a human, as well as communicates basic information about, you know, the layout of this place. It's a sentimental piece as well. Here's another park map by Tom Patterson. This is a desert park, Canyonlands National Park. These sort of deep canyons carved by rivers over time. One of the things that he did was he spent a lot of time developing sort of very detailed rock textures. So if you look in the river canyon, you see the very detailed striations where the river has carved through over time. And what function does that serve? It probably doesn't give people information they need when they're navigating around the park. But again, it imbues people with a sense of the beauty of the place. And it's the sort of detail that makes me feel like a person was at the other end of this map, somebody who paid attention to these details, somebody who wanted to design something that captured his experience of the park and conveyed it to me. And the last one I'll share with you, just to give you, a broad example here, because these are all different from each other, right? We can be very human in our design and with a wide variety of aesthetic styles. So here's one by Carl Sluis about noise complaints in Manhattan, in New York. And it's very simple, right? We don't have to be complicated to design for humans, and we don't have to be hand-drawn. This is simply circles plotted exactly where there are noise complaints in New York, and then the number of noise complaints means more circles, larger circles. But what connects to me about this thing, what seems very human, is it's very clever symbology. It's simple, it's clean, but it's also a very clever way of indicating something. The noise, in fact, makes the shape of Manhattan, and it doesn't even need to indicate where the boundaries of the island are, for example. It's all clearly marked out, plus a few labels to give you some spatial context. And I think, cleverness is another thing that makes me feel like there's a human being at the other end of this. And I like this aesthetically. And of course, different people have different taste. Right? There's different styles of maps that different people like, certainly. But we, again, wouldn't mistake this as something that came up in a default. It took thought. It took intention. It was designed. And so that's what connects to me about this. So that's my thoughts on design. I think it's something that it's important to consider, especially now in modern cartography, because we have the ability to do more work without thinking about it as much as perhaps we used to. And I don't mean to rail against machines, right, and software. They're very useful. We can do so much now with cartographic software versus certainly that picture of a person hunched over drawing by hand. I don't want to do that. I would not have survived in an era of manual cartography. I don't have the patience for it. And we're able now with big data and with GIS processing to see so much more information about our world. But the thing we need to keep in mind is that humans need to be in control of the process. We can't surrender our decision-making to what is simple and what is convenient and what is default. We need to think through why we are using these tools the way they are. And remember that they are tools. They should not be in charge. They should not be making the decisions. We make the decisions, then we leave the labor to the tools. The labor should go into the software. So with that, I think I'm done, and I will take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. We have a few questions collected here already, and we will read them out, or try to read them out at least because... okay. One question is, I'm a geographer, not a cartographer. Thus, I would like to differentiate between design creatively and overkill. This can happen easily. How do you get the balance? At the end of the day, everyone thinks that their own map looks good. Are there a set of rules to follow? Hope this makes sense.
Yes, so this is my students are always very frustrated at me because there aren't any rules, unfortunately, to making good maps. I mean, if there were a set of rules, actually it would be a lot easier for machines to simply automate most of what cartographers do. We could encode them with all the rules and tell them to go. But there's so much creativity that needs to be involved, and so much experience, too. That's actually a point that I often make to my students because, again, you look at perhaps some of these maps and you say they're very beautiful. I could never do something like this. But we actually all can. In the same way that we've learned to design our own breakfast. That's not something we were born with the ability to do. It's something we learned over time, a skill. And it's simply a matter of how much time and skill you want to devote to it. As far as overkill goes, it's certainly possible to overdo some of these things, and I am probably as guilty of that as many other people. I can be very overly detail obsessive. So sometimes when I'm making maps, I zoom in 6,400% and tweak things that no one will ever see. And I think the way you get around a lot of that, and around almost any potential failing that you might have as an individual designer, is simply to show your work to a large number of people and ask for their opinions. So if I think, the questioner makes the point, everyone thinks their own map looks good, and that's usually true. But perhaps other people don't think my map looks good, and I can find that out if I show it to them. And hopefully I am wise enough to listen to the advice of my colleagues and friends. And there's a balance to that because certainly they will all have different opinions. But I often find if I show a first draft to somebody, if I show it to 10 people, perhaps 7 or 8 of them will make the same comments. And if that many of them are making the same comment, I need to consider that very carefully and perhaps make some changes. And then perhaps I'll do a second draft and show it. And eventually after a number of drafts, you start to iron out you start to realize that most people no longer have major problems with it, and then it starts to come down to minor matters, hopefully of simple individual taste, and then you can start to wrap things up. But is any map ever done? Is any painting ever done? Or any paper ever done? You could always do more drafts, but hopefully after the first couple of ones, you've got some good advice from other people who are keeping you from making mistakes and being caught up in your own vision.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question in here. You mentioned that there's a mistake to make the design at the end of the mapping process. So do you think this could be applied in all cases? So that this true in all times?
Yeah, I mean, we are always deciding what to do when we make a map or when we do many other things in life. So we can't create a map and then design it because the process of making the map is a design. Right? So if I look at any of these things, there's the choice of making a map in the first place is a design decision. Going out and surveying the data, deciding what information to collect is a design decision. Or I don't know if I have a, let me see if I got an example here of like a classed, actually yeah, let's look at this. So here's land cover data. So some of you probably worked with land cover information. And down in the corner here talks about there's ice and snow, there's barren vegetation, there's different kinds of forests, but that's a design decision. What sorts of land cover data will I use? Because if you get these data sets, they're actually 20 or 30 different classes, separating different kinds of trees and different kinds of vegetation and separating sand from rock. And so the person who made this map, Tom Patterson, decided, well, I will collect all the things that say rock or sand and barren and empty land, and I'll call them just barren. And I'll collect all the different kinds of trees at the different densities and just call it deciduous forest. And that's before making the map. That's just working with the data. And that's a design decision. So we need to think about our final product throughout the whole process. It's not simply something that we bring in at the end. Certainly the aesthetics, or making things look attractive, that's part of it. That's a design decision as well. You have, what do you want the map reader to understand and to appreciate about a place, and part of that will go into the colors you choose and the styles that you choose. But even before you start plotting anything, while you're still just loading in your data in ArcMap and processing it and doing your analysis, that's still design decisions, and that has to feed into part of the whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So you made a strong point for individually crafted, let's say, human maps, and contrast that with more or less default-heavy inhuman maps. So there's a lot of effort at the moment going in making better defaults, and there's one question from a colleague of mine who had the same thing in mind. I'd be interested in your opinion on Esri's strategy of smart maps. Mark Harrow, I think, is strongly involved here. In ArcGIS Online, which pretend to do all the design work for the user. So is it default or design, or how do you think of this idea of analyzing the data to find the best, more or less, the best kind of defaults?
Yes, I think, and that's a very good point to bring up. It sort of, it adds to the sort of simplified view I was presenting. Mark Harrower was actually my advisor. I was his last student at the University of Wisconsin before he went out into the private industry. And this is something that he's done a lot of work for the past several years, at least as long as I've known him, for 6 or 7 years. He's been very focused on how can we create software that helps people make better maps. And so one product that he helped put together, perhaps some of you have seen, is called IndieMapper, INDIE mapper.com, and it's a sort of online, simple GIS and mapping tool. And one of the things that IndieMapper tries to do is make decisions for you based on looking at what you're trying to present. And when it can't make a decision for you, it presents you a very simplified set of alternatives along with some a little quick tutorial in case you're not familiar with choosing a good color scheme. It will make some simplified recommendations. And I think those are great tools. We want smarter defaults, right? And perhaps it's a continuum, right, between a very thoughtless default on one end, and on the other end of the continuum, on the other end of the spectrum, is a completely individual-driven, everything thought-through designer. And there can be some in-between. I would certainly like if my software knew what I wanted to do ahead of time. But I guess the important thing is, even if our software gets smarter, we still need to be there to double-check its decisions. It might make a good decision from the beginning. Perhaps it's been coded intelligently enough to choose a good color scheme. But we need to use our judgment at the end to say, yes, I agree with the software, or I need to change what it's doing. And so there's still, hopefully the effort is saved on the human end, and it makes a smart decision right away. But it would be impossible, at least with our, in the current day and age, to create something that will always make the best decision, or the one that is most pleasing to the person creating it, or most in line with their vision every single time. If we start to develop more advanced artificial intelligence, who knows what's going to happen 20 years from now. But at that point, we'll probably have more interesting sort of debates about the place of computers in society than worrying about how they make maps if we have intelligent machines.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm wondering all the time why you and our colleagues are using the word defaults instead of standardized way of visualizing things, but maybe I'm too standard biased and I see things a bit different. Now I'd like to take the next question. So somebody is asking, so the last phrases mean also that the GIS people should not use too complicated black box models if the resulting maps can't be fully interpreted without long explanations.
Yeah, so I mean, complexity, complexity can be both good and bad. It sort of depends very much on your goal in a map. I think that if you're reaching a specialist audience, and perhaps you're preparing a map for some sort of report for specialists, then it makes perfect sense to present something maybe more in-depth, more complicated, that people will want to spend time reading through. But if I'm presenting for a general audience, maybe I want to tell a very simple, basic story. It's also dependent on the amount of time you expect your audience to spend on looking at a complicated visualization, not just a map, any sort of graphic. The more information you put on there, the more time it's going to take somebody to understand it. But there is definitely a balance between complexity and clarity, and where that balance falls, I think, depends on who's reading it and how much time they have, and what their understanding is of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, take the last question. We have another question from one of our colleagues. With open source mapping applications gaining functionality and allowing users to make their own maps, what do you think the future of map makers are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're definitely in a different, I think, well, I sort of go back and forth a little about this. Lay people have always made their own maps. They did not necessarily look as professional as they do nowadays. I think the gap in the gap that's really being closed is now it's easier for lay people to make professional-looking maps. But in an earlier era, certainly people would always sketch maps on napkins or paint them on signs. So there's always been sort of a folk cartography. But yeah, access to data and access to more professional software has improved. Although we should be careful. We should be careful not to call it. Some people like to call it a sort of democratization of cartography. But I think that's too broad, because it's still limited to people who have the resources and the luxury of time to participate in something like this. Certainly there's a huge chunk of the world that still doesn't have electricity, so they're certainly not participating in this open bloom of mapping. But it's definitely expanded to a wider variety of audience. I think that it's producing more maps. Certainly I think that maps have exploded in popularity online. But I think among a lot of people it's produced an appreciation for the skill and craft that a trained cartographer brings to things. I think what I do and what cartographers do will always be a limited field, a niche field. Right? It's not something that everybody who needs a map will come and find us and hire us for. But I don't think it's going to put us out of business by any means, because I think the sorts of people who hire us understand, and I hope they understand, and I wish they would understand in more detail, the fact that we are not simply plotting points. Right? This is not simply a technical skill that anybody can, that sort of anybody can pick up in 5 or 10 minutes. We're skilled at storytelling, and we're skilled at aesthetics, and we're skilled at design, and that's where the value in cartography lies. But for many people, they don't necessarily need that value. For a lot of basic purposes, we don't necessarily need to spend a huge amount of time going all out. I would love all maps to be beautiful, but I know that's not practical. And there are certainly better things to do with our time as a society than make every single map look like this national park map here for every possible thing. You don't want your sort of city, perhaps your simple city plot maps or something like that, or road networks. We don't need to spend that kind of effort for city planning. So there's definitely a balance here to what I'm saying, and a time and a place to expend this extra effort. But what I want to emphasize is that the effort is worth expending in some situations where people want to be unique. And when Google Maps, when it was possible to start embedding Google Maps in your website, for example, a lot of businesses did that to show where you could drive to their business. But now a lot of them are saying they want custom maps because they don't want to look like every other business's website. So I think the boom in mapping has raised attention to mapping and made people realize that there are situations where they might want to hire somebody else to do a more detailed job and to make use of their experience and skill.
Maybe my last comment before handing it over to you, Christoph. So we know that professionals can lie with maps. and maybe the users in the future will be, let's say, able to lie with maps as well. The non-professionals, I mean, maybe they will do that more by mistake than on purpose. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, there's always, you might say all maps are lies in some fashion, that we must, the extent to which we have to simplify the world to fit it onto a map, or even if we're dealing with projections, certainly scale bars on maps are always lies at some places. There's always the potential for abuse and misuse, and I sort of emphasize to my students the ethical responsibilities that they have when they're mapping. But I think that, in any sort of form of communication, there's always going to be people who will misuse it, and more maps might mean more lies. We'll have to see how that turns out.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was a quite nice end word. More maps mean more lies.
Yes.
As long as we have the humans in the loop, we should take the risk.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you from our side, and also thank you from some of our participants. For example, Stefan from Winterthur, he said this was a great webinar and very interesting. Thank you.
Wonderful.
We fully agree with you, Stefan.
We fully agree, yes.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you all enjoyed it.
Yes, it was great to have you here.
Right, I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm not a cartographer, so I'm trying to learn from you guys, and for me it was a really interesting talk, so thank you very much, Daniel.
Okay.
Examples, good example maps are probably the best way to learn, looking at other people's maps and simply, sort of applying your own opinions to them and what you like and don't forces you to sort of really get into them and learn a lot.